Salvete discipuli. In this module, we will be learning about the perfect system of Latin verbs. You remember that in the previous module, we had learned about the present system. Can anyone remind us of what the three tenses are that make up the present system? As we correctly remembered, the present system is made up of the present, the imperfect, and the future tense. The three tenses that make up the perfect system, as you may have already guessed if you are looking at your verb ending chart, are the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect tense. These names sound somewhat funny, especially the pluperfect, and sometimes we want to think that these tenses don't exist anyplace else outside of Latin. But the truth is that all three of these tenses, the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect, also exist in English and are three tenses that we should learn to use in our own language as well as in Latin. In fact, the knowledge and use of these tenses sometimes forms the basis for certain SAT questions. You know the ones where they give you a sentence and they have something, they ask you if there is something wrong with this sentence, and then they give you 3 or 4 choices and say, should it be written like this, or this, or this, or is there nothing wrong? And often verb tenses are one of the issues that they focus on. So as we go through the next several slides, we're going to learn about some of the things that are the same and different between the perfect system and the present system. We're going to learn about each of the specific tenses in English and in Latin, and by the time you're finished with this, you'll know how to conjugate and translate Latin verbs in the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tense into English, and hopefully you'll know something about how to use them in English as well. When we start to talk about the perfect system, I'd like us to think back to the present system and remember some things about it. It's always a really good idea to try to connect the new item that you are learning to what you have previously learned so that you can build upon the information that you have and use it to help yourself learn the new item better. In the present system, we learned that all actions are currently taking place or are incomplete. In the perfect system, all of the actions that we are reading about have already been completed. One of the big differences between the present system and the perfect system, and the way that you will be able to distinguish between a perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tense verb, is by looking at the base that is built on. The present, the imperfect, and the future tense use the second principal part of the verb for its base. But in the perfect system, all three of those tenses, the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, will use the third principal part as its base. If you look at the third principal part of verbs, their spellings often look very different from the second principal part. Connecting vowels were quite the challenge when dealing with the present, the imperfect, and the future tenses. And so something that you can all rejoice about is that when you are conjugating verbs in the perfect system, there are no connecting vowels needed. When we work with the present system, we have to understand how irregular verbs function differently or are conjugated differently than all other verbs in the present system tenses. But when we work in the perfect system, you'll be pleased to know that irregular verbs are not treated any differently than all other verbs. So when we learn the conjugating procedure for the perfect system, it will apply to every verb, including irregulars. As we move into this part of the lesson, we're going to discuss each of the tenses and focus on what they look like in English. Let's begin with the perfect tense, which is the first tense that is listed on the chart and the first of the perfect system tenses. The perfect tense communicates an action that took place in the definite past. This would be like the English simple past tense. It is also used to communicate an action that starts at an indefinite time in the past and continues into the present. Let's take a look at a few examples, and then I want to show you a nifty little thing I discovered about using VoiceThread just recently. The first example talks about a very specific time in the past, yesterday. So, yesterday I walked to the forest. It's a simple past tense, formed with many English verbs simply by adding ed. Last week, also giving a specific time, I did build a house. So we can use did to make the simple past tense emphatic. In the next two examples, we are looking at a use of the perfect tense, which discusses an indefinite time in the past and may also continue into the present. For example, many times in the past, I don't have any one specific date in mind, I have sailed to Italy. This sentence communicates that I likely still do. He has given me a birthday present since I was 5 and still continues to do so today. So these translations of the verb in the simple past, using did to make it emphatic, or working with the helping verb have or has, depending on the subject, are the methods that we will use to translate the perfect tense forms of Latin into English. If you would like to understand more about the perfect tense in English, what I need for you to do is click on this button right here, and it will take you to a short YouTube video that will explain the use and give examples of the perfect tense in English. Specifically, something called the present perfect in English. Have fun with that. When we think about the perfect system, I want you to think about the three different tenses, the perfect, the pluperfect, and the future perfect, as communicating sequence of action. The perfect tense, which we discussed on the last slide, is the simple past tense. The pluperfect tense is used to talk about an action that was completed in the past before some other action was completed in the past. In order to communicate that sequence, that this action in the pluperfect was completed longer ago than some other action, we are required to use the helping verb had in English, plus the past participle of the verb. Look at these sentence examples from the stories we recently read about Asclepius and King Admetus. Jupiter killed, simple past tense verb, Asclepius, because the young doctor had offended Pluto. This had offended communicates that Asclepius's action of offending Pluto took place prior to Jupiter's action of killing Asclepius. That makes sense. King Admetus lived because his wife had sacrificed her life for him. So here again we have to understand that his ability to continue to live is occurring because the sacrifice occurred prior to that. When Hercules arrived, Alcestis had already died. So Hercules arrived, but her death had taken place before that. If you would like more information about using the pluperfect tense in English, please click on this link button and it will take you to a short YouTube video showing you the use of the pluperfect tense in English. Finally, we come to the future perfect tense, which is a tense that is very seldom used in both Latin and English. It's almost a really bizarre tense, like science fiction in a way, because the future perfect is talking about something that hasn't happened. It's in the future, but it's talking about it in a way that discusses its completion in the future. Really bizarre. Look at some of the examples and I think you'll be able to clearly see what I mean. By the time Hercules arrives, so this communicates that we're setting ourselves in the future. Hercules hasn't arrived yet, but by the time he does, Alcestis will have died. And this is something that we know because we've read the story, but as we look at the story, we're talking about future events in the story. Will, that makes it future. The have died part of it makes it perfect. King Admetus hopes that before Apollo leaves, so Apollo hasn't left, but he knows that someday he will, so that's the future, and he hopes that before he does, the fields will have produced much grain. Future perfect. And this final example, by the time a Roman girl reaches age 17, so I'm talking about a point in her future, she will have been married and will have given birth to at least one child. Those are items that are in the future. And I realize that my sentence almost makes it sound like she will have been married to and given birth to that one child. Of course, that's not what I mean to say. She will have been married to her husband and will have given birth to at least one child. If you would like further information and examples, please click on this button which will take you to a short YouTube video at the link that you see here, and you can have perhaps a more thorough understanding of the future perfect in our language, English. Over the next several slides, I am going to show you an English sentence with the verb underlined, and I want you to be able to identify the tense of the verb as perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect. When you advance to the next slide, I will tell you the answer. Please record your answer by writing or speaking. Let's return to our first slide to learn that sailed is in the perfect tense. Now determine the tense of the verb has visited. Taking a look at the previous sentence, we see that has visited is the perfect tense. In our new sentence, what is the tense of the verb gave? Let's return to the previous sentence and see if you correctly identified gave as the perfect tense. In our new sentence, the verb phrase is will have died. Do you know what tense that is? In the sentence, before the war is over, more than 500 soldiers will have died. Will have died is an example of the future perfect tense. Can anyone explain why the future perfect tense is needed in this sentence? Now let's look at our new sentence. You are asked to think about what tense had placed is in. You should notice that in this particular sentence there are two verbs, but we only want to identify the tense of the first verb. Before we consider the verb tense of this sentence, let us return to the previous sentence to learn that had placed is in the pluperfect tense. Remember, I pointed out that there are two verbs in this sentence, and that will usually be the case when using the pluperfect tense because it is communicating the sequence of action. So the placing of the food on the table had to occur before the guests could begin eating, and that's how we express that idea in English. What tense is the verb had received? I know you are anxious to determine the tense of verb in the new sentence, but let's return to this one and discover that had received is the pluperfect tense. But what I'm more interested in is if there is anyone who can explain to me why the pluperfect tense is needed in this sentence. Now consider the verb form will have risen in this sentence. This is our final verb tense example in English. Before we look at it, let's go back to the previous sentence and understand that will have risen is in the future perfect. Can anyone explain to me why the future perfect tense is needed in this sentence? What will you identify the verb form or the verb tense in this sentence as? Perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect? Has mistreated. Which tense is it? The next step of this lesson is to learn the conjugating procedure for the perfect system. Can anyone remind us of the conjugating procedure for the present system? It had 3 steps instead of 2. If you have not already taken out your verb ending chart, which you have endings written on for the present system, you should do so now. And I'd like you to find on it the boxes underneath the chart itself on the left side of the paper. There's a small box on the bottom left side beneath the chart which lists the conjugating procedure for the perfect system. It's two simple steps. The first step is to find the base of the third principal part. That's the big difference between the present system and the perfect system. Now remember that principal parts are listed on a vocabulary list. And when you look at verbs on a vocabulary list, you might see 2, 3, or 4 different words. Those are the principal parts, and they are simply numbered left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we will need to be able to find the third principal part and its base, and then we will simply add endings. That's all there is to conjugating. Remember that this procedure is used for all verbs in Latin, including irregular verbs. To find the base of the third principal part, you are simply going to remove the final I from the third principal part. Here is the verb to be in Latin. Sum, esse, this is its second principal part, or infinitive, and here is its third principal part, fui, F-U-I. To get the base of the third principal part, remove the final I, and what is left over is the base. This is the only time you get to answer me by saying F-U. If you need practice or want practice, and I encourage you to do this, you notice this link button here. If you click on this, it will take you to a set of Quizlet flashcards to practice finding or writing the base of the third principal parts of verbs. So you click on this, and it will open it up magically for you, and you can practice. Hopefully you have mastered the first step of the conjugating procedure for the perfect system, which is finding the base of the third principal part. If this is the third principal part of the verb to give, what is its base? Please write your answers. Before you go on and learn about the endings, which is the second step for conjugating all verbs in the perfect system, we need to now add the endings to our base. If you do not have your verb ending chart in front of you, please make sure to get it now. Just a reminder that this is what our verb ending chart looks like. You should already have a copy of this with this entire section filled in. And we are now going to be focused on the bottom half of this chart, which is where we will find the perfect system and the perfect system tenses. And here is where you will always be able to find the conjugating procedure for the perfect system. You ready to learn some endings? Let's move on. Here are the perfect tense endings. I will pronounce them so that you can hear them and then write them in your chart. I, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt. The I is pronounced E because it is a long I, so it is pronounced E. Isti ends with a long I, and Arunt, the E is long, which is why it sounds like Arunt. I think it's also important for you to write on your chart this very important note in the gray box. Below this line, use the base of the third principal part. I think it is also very important for you to note right here that you use notes for both regular and irregular verbs. If you have an irregular verb chart, you may take it out and copy all of these same things on that chart. I am not going to have another lesson that specifically addresses irregular verbs. I just need you to understand that they will function exactly the same way as regular verbs. One of the things that's interesting to note about the perfect system is that the first person singular and the second person singular do not use the traditional personal pronoun endings to recognize the subject of the verb. For the first person singular, we are very attuned to seeing O or M on the end of the verb ending, inflection, to indicate that the subject is I, but in the perfect system, the perfect tense does not use O or M, instead it uses the letter I. It also does not use the letter S, which we see prominently on the end of every present system verb inflection. The ending of this verb ending is also the letter I, even though it has an S here. The very end of it is just the letter I. So these two might require a bit more thought when you're reading to recognize them as the first person and second person singular with subjects I and you. Fortunately for us, those verb forms are not the most popular used. Most popular used verb forms are third person singular and third person plural. Especially when we are telling stories or reading history or reporting, just about everything is done in the third person. And so we are very, very familiar with the T ending or the NT ending that we see representing third person plural. So once again, I wanted to point that out to you, not just because these items are different, but also because there's so much that you already know, and you need to connect what you're learning new to what you have already learned. Once more, I'll pronounce the endings. E, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt. If you want to practice remembering the endings, I have another link button that you can click on. It will take you to a set of Quizlet flashcards, which will help you to practice. On this slide, you see the pluperfect tense endings. Eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratis, erant. And the way that we will translate verbs from Latin that have these endings attached to the base of the third principal part into English. Notice that these endings do rely on the same subject endings that we are familiar with from the present system, MST, MUS, TIS, and T. If you're wondering if these endings sound familiar or look familiar, don't think you're going crazy. They actually should look familiar to you, because when these endings are not attached to the base of the third principal part, they are, by themselves, the imperfect tense of the verb to be. It's nice that something we learn is doing double duty, just like all of our first and second declension noun endings did double duty as first and second declension adjective endings, and the same was true for most of our third declension noun endings. So the work that you did remembering eram, eras, erat, eramos, eratus, erant as the imperfect tense of to be is now put to good use by remembering that when you attach that to the base of the third principal part, you are creating the pluperfect verb tense. I have a link right here to a set of Quizlet flashcards so that you can practice remembering. Our final set of endings are the future perfect tense endings. Be very careful as you write these because they too look familiar to you. These look almost entirely like the future tense form of to be, but I caution you to be careful because as you approach the third person plural, what you want to notice is that instead of erunt, E-R-U-N-T, like it is for the future tense of to be, we have erint, E-R-I-N-T. So the endings are ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint, E-R-I-N-T. We do see that the traditional letters representing first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, first person plural, second person plural, and third person plural are in play. That makes life a little easier. And then we have the challenge of remembering that instead of erunt, which we learned for the future tense of to be, we have erint. Remember that in the future tense, I and we are most correctly translated with the helping verb shall. If you substitute will, that's okay. Everybody will understand you. To practice remembering your future perfect tense endings, there is this link, and all you have to do is click on that, and it will take you to a set of Quizlet flashcards, which you can use to help yourself remember ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint. The next 12 slides will give you an opportunity to practice writing or conjugating regular and irregular verbs in the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect tenses. Can you remind me of what the 2 steps are for conjugating all verbs, regular and irregular, no matter what conjugation, in the perfect system tenses? Please make sure to complete all 12 slides. It's really only 6 questions. And then we will practice recognizing the verb tenses and translating them. Because this is the first time you've actually written anything in the perfect system, I'm going to help you by talking through it, and then I won't do it anymore. Remember that you're going to start by getting the base of the third principal part. 1, 2, 3. So here is our third principal part. So you start by writing the base of the third principal part, and you are supposed to write each verb tense in the third person plural. So remember that once you write your third principal part, all you have to do is attach the third person plural ending for each tense. If you have any questions about why these answers are correct, please email me or ask your question here, and I will respond as quickly as I can. Just a reminder that although this is an irregular verb, we treat it the same as we do all other verbs when we are writing it in the perfect system. The reason that we spend so much time memorizing endings and practicing writing endings is so that when we are reading, we will know exactly what we're looking at and how to translate it. In the next number of slides from here until the end of the voice thread, and there are quite a few of them, you will get the opportunity to practice recognizing whether the verb form is written in the perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect tense. I am requiring you to do the first 5 questions with me, and then you have a choice to move into Quizlet or to stay here in VoiceThread before you move on to the What Do You Know quiz that will complete this lesson. So let's see if you can discover what tense. Please write or record your voice giving me a correct translation for this verb form. Before you can do that, however, I have to correct the verb form. I notice just now that I have it misspelled. It should be RELIQUERAT. I was using the base of the second principal part when I should have been relying on the base of the third principal part. I do apologize and hope I don't have any more of those kinds of errors. If you do not understand why the translations of any of these verb forms in these last 5 slides are correct, please email me so that we can clear up any confusion that you have. At this point, the lesson is basically concluded, and all you really need to do is more practice. To practice, you can continue here in the voice thread, working with the types of questions that you have just answered, or you can use this link to take you to a set of Quizlet flashcards in which you will be asked to do what we are doing right here, as well as conjugating or writing verb forms. You must either complete this practice or the flashcard practice before you go in to take the What Do You Know quiz, which will complete this lesson. There is also a link to the flashcards on the very last slide of this voice thread lesson.